The spear. First, the spear. If you had to pick one weapon that shows up almost everywhere in the ancient world, it would probably be this one. It was simple, cheap, and deadly. You just needed a long wooden shaft and a sharpened tip made from stone, bronze, or iron, depending on the time period. What made the spear so useful was reach. A soldier with a spear could hit an enemy before that enemy got close enough to use a sword or dagger. That mattered a lot in crowded battles. Greek hoplites used long spears in tight formations, and later the Macedonians made them even longer with the sarissa, turning whole lines of soldiers into moving walls of points. The spear was also easy to make compared to a sword. Not every soldier could afford a fine blade, but many could carry a spear. That is one reason ancient armies were full of them. And this idea of winning with reach does not stop here. When we get to siege weapons later, you'll see that armies kept using the same logic on a much bigger scale. Hit the enemy before they can hit you.
2. The sword. Probably the most famous ancient weapon, even if it was not always the most important one. Swords were sidearms in many armies, not always the main tool. They were for close combat, when formations broke, when a spear snapped, or when fighting got messy and personal. Swords came in many shapes. The Greek xiphos was short and made for stabbing and slashing. The Roman gladius was also short, built for brutal close fighting. Roman soldiers often used it after throwing a javelin and moving in behind their shields. The sword had one big weakness: cost. Good swords took more skill, more metal, and more time to make. That meant they were valuable. In some cultures, a sword was not just a weapon, it was also a status symbol. So even though movies often make it look like everyone fought with swords, ancient battlefields were usually less glamorous and more practical. Spears were more common. Still, when fighting got close, the sword became the weapon that could decide everything in seconds. But even a great sword was not enough on its own, because surviving mattered just as much as attacking.
3. The shield. That brings us to the shield. In many ancient armies, the shield was not just protection, it was part of the whole fighting system. A good shield could stop arrows, block spear thrusts, and give a soldier confidence to move forward. Different armies used different shapes. Greek hoplites carried the large round hoplon, which helped create the famous phalanx. Roman soldiers used the scudum, a large curved shield that covered much of the body and worked well in formation. Other groups used smaller round shields for speed. The shield changed how battles looked. Instead of warriors just charging in alone, soldiers could lock together and form a wall. That made armies more disciplined and harder to break. In some battles, the man beside you mattered almost as much as your own skill, because his shield might protect your side. And this idea of protection keeps growing as we move through the list. A handheld shield was one thing. Later, whole siege machines would basically become giant moving shields on wheels.
4. The bow and arrow. Now let's talk about the bow and arrow. This was one of the oldest and most feared weapons in history. It let soldiers kill from a distance, sometimes before the enemy could even respond. Ancient bows came in different forms. Simple wooden bows were common, but composite bows, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, were stronger and more compact. These were especially useful for mounted archers because they could fire from horseback. Egyptians, Assyrians, Persians, Scythians, and many others used archers well. In the right hands, arrows could break formations, cause panic, and weaken an army before close combat even started. But bows had limits too. They took practice. A strong war bow was not easy to use. Weather mattered. Armor also changed how effective arrows could be. That problem forced armies to keep adapting. If arrows could kill you before you got close, then you needed better armor, better shields, or better tactics. And one ancient solution to mobility and ranged power was fast, loud, and dramatic.
5. The chariot. The chariot was one of the most impressive battle tools of the early ancient world.
Before cavalry became dominant, the chariot gave rulers a fast and powerful way to move warriors across the battlefield. A chariot was usually a light two-wheeled vehicle pulled by horses. It often carried a driver and a fighter, sometimes an archer or a spear thrower. Civilizations like the Egyptians, Hittites, and later some Chinese states used chariots in war. The power of the chariot came from speed and shock. It could move quickly, attack the sides of enemy formations, and make a battlefield feel chaotic. It also looked impressive, which mattered. Ancient warfare was physical, but it was also psychological. Noise, speed, and fear could break morale. Still, chariots had serious weaknesses. They needed open ground. Rough terrain could ruin them. As cavalry improved, horses with riders became more flexible and practical. So the chariot was powerful, but not permanent. Ancient warfare kept changing, and some of the biggest changes came not in open fields, but at city walls.
6. The battering ram. Now we move to siege warfare, starting with the battering ram. This was one of the simplest and most brutal ways to break into a fortified city. At its core, a battering ram was just a heavy beam used to smash gates or walls. But over time, armies made it much more advanced. A basic ram could be carried by soldiers. Larger ones were hung by ropes or chains inside a wooden frame so they could swing with more force. Some were covered by a roof to protect the crew from arrows, fire, and dropped stones. Wet animal hides were sometimes placed over the structure to help resist flames. The point was simple: keep hitting the same spot until something gave way. This shows a huge truth about ancient war. Walls changed everything. Once cities built strong defenses, armies had to become engineers too. Winning was no longer just about brave soldiers. It was about tools, planning, and patience. And if a battering ram was the answer to gates, the next machines were built to attack from farther away.
7. The catapult. The catapult changed siege warfare by letting armies throw force over distance. Instead of walking up to a wall and risking death right under it, attackers could stand back and launch stones or other projectiles. Ancient catapults were developed in the Greek world and later used widely by the Romans and others. Many worked through torsion power, using twisted ropes made from hair or sinew to store energy. When released, that energy hurled a projectile forward. Catapults could damage walls, break enemy defenses, and terrify the people inside a city. Even when they did not destroy much, the constant threat wore defenders down. There is also a mental side here. Imagine being inside a city and hearing heavy stones slam into towers day after day. Siege warfare was not just about force. It was about pressure, fear, and exhaustion. But catapults were not the most precise ancient machines. For that, another weapon stood out, and it looked almost like a giant bow. 8. The ballista. The ballista was basically a massive ancient bolt thrower. It worked a bit like a giant crossbow and was designed for more direct, aimed shots than a stone-throwing catapult. Ballistas fired large bolts or darts, and in some cases stones. They could target enemy troops, defenders on walls, and weak points in fortifications. Roman armies especially valued them because they added ranged power and control to a siege or even to open battle. What made the ballista so dangerous was accuracy. A catapult could smash and scatter, but a ballista could strike more exactly. That made it useful for picking off defenders who thought they were safe behind the walls. This is one of the most interesting things about ancient warfare. Even thousands of years ago, armies wanted the same things modern armies want: range, power, and accuracy. But even with machines firing at walls, attackers still had one huge problem. Sooner or later, someone had to get up there.
9. The siege tower. That is where the siege tower comes in. A siege tower was a tall wooden structure, often built on wheels, that soldiers could push toward a city wall. The idea was to protect attackers as they got close, and then let them climb up and fight at the same height as the defenders. Some siege towers had multiple levels.
Archers could fire from inside them, while other soldiers prepared to cross onto the wall using drawbridges or ramps. In theory, it was a smart answer to high walls. In reality, it was risky. Siege towers were huge, slow, and hard to move. Defenders tried to burn them, break them, or trap them before they reached the wall. Building one also took time and materials. Still, when they worked, they could completely change a siege. Instead of staring up at a wall, attackers could suddenly meet defenders face to face. And that brings us to the final piece, because whether you were on the wall, under the tower, or out in the field, one thing often decided whether you lived long enough to fight at all.
10. Armor and helmets. Last is battle gear itself, especially armor and helmets. Ancient soldiers wore many kinds depending on where and when they fought. Some had padded cloth armor, some wore leather, some had bronze breastplates, and later many used scale armor or mail. Helmets also varied a lot, from simple caps to heavy metal designs that covered the cheeks and neck. Good armor could mean the difference between a wound and survival. It helped protect against arrows, sword cuts, and spear thrusts. Helmets were especially important because head injuries could end a fight instantly. But armor always came with trade-offs. More protection usually meant more weight. A heavily armored soldier was safer, but often slower and more tired. So armies had to balance defense with movement. And that is really the story behind all of these ancient weapons and machines. None of them existed alone. Every new tool created a new problem. Spears led to shields, arrows led to armor, walls led to battering rams, catapults, ballistas, and siege towers. Ancient warfare was basically a long race between attack and defense, and each weapon on this list was one more step in that race.